Before we jump into today's story, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Hidden Karma Stories, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single comment, and I love seeing how far these stories travel around the world. Now let's get into today's story. I'm 33 years old, and for almost 7 years I worked as a payroll and accounts coordinator at a mid-sized logistics company in Columbus, Ohio. It's not a glamorous job. I process payroll, I reconcile vendor accounts, and twice a year I help calculate the company's profit-sharing distribution, which gets split among full-time employees based on tenure and salary. For me, that distribution wasn't just a bonus. It was my house fund. I'd been putting every single profit-sharing check straight into a separate savings account since my second year there, and I'd done the math down to the dollar. 3 more years of decent payouts, and I'd have a 20% down payment on a house in a neighborhood I actually wanted to live in. So when the profit-sharing numbers started shrinking, I noticed. The first year it dropped, nobody thought much of it. Our CEO, a guy named Walt who started the company almost 30 years ago, stood up at the all-hands meeting and talked about rising fuel costs and a couple of clients who'd gone elsewhere. That happens. Logistics is a thin-margin business. I didn't question it. The second year it dropped again, and that's when I started paying closer attention because shrinking profit-sharing 2 years in a row, while our client list was actually growing, didn't add up the way it should have on paper. I want to be clear that I wasn't looking for trouble. I liked my job. I liked most of the people I worked with. The man who eventually became the center of all of this, our operations director, Greg Sutton, had actually been kind to me when I started, the kind of guy who remembered your coffee order and asked about your weekend. He'd been with the company for 14 years, longer than almost anyone except Walt himself, and everyone treated him like he was untouchable, because in a lot of ways he was. It started with something small. Part of my job is processing vendor invoices for payment, and every month I'd see a line item for consulting services, billed by a company called Meridian Freight Consulting. The invoices were always approved directly by Greg, which wasn't unusual on its own since he had authority over operational vendors, but the amounts were large. $12,000 to $18,000 a month, sometimes more, for something vague like logistics optimization and route consulting. I didn't think anything of it at first. Companies hire consultants, that's normal. But that wasn't the part that eventually bothered me. Few months later, I was processing a return because one of Meridian's checks had bounced back to us, undeliverable, wrong suite number. I pulled up their file to correct the mailing address, and the address listed for Meridian Freight Consulting wasn't an office building. It was a residential complex about 15 minutes from our headquarters. I told myself maybe it was a home office, which a lot of small consultants run out of. I corrected the address, sent the check, and moved on with my day. I wish I could say that was the last time I thought about it. It wasn't. A few weeks after that, I was doing a routine audit of our vendor list, something I did every quarter just to make sure we weren't paying anyone twice or sending money to a closed account. When I searched Meridian Freight Consulting in the Ohio Secretary of State Business Registry, just out of curiosity, nothing came up. No LLC filing, no corporate registration, nothing. That's when the small, uneasy feeling I'd had for a few weeks turned into something sharper. I went back through our payment history and pulled every invoice we'd paid to Meridian going back as far as our system would let me. It took me almost 2 hours, sitting at my desk after everyone else had gone home, scrolling through line after line. By the time I was done, I had a number in front of me that made my stomach drop. Over the past 3 years, our company had paid Meridian Freight Consulting more than $400,000. For a business that, according to the state of Ohio, didn't exist. I sat there for a long time just looking at the screen. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe it was registered in a different state. Maybe it operated under a different legal name and Meridian was just a DBA. I wasn't ready to assume the worst, because the worst thing I was thinking didn't feel real yet. The next morning I brought it to my direct supervisor, a woman named Carol who managed the accounting team. I expected her to be concerned. Instead, she got visibly uncomfortable, glanced at her office door like she wanted to make sure it was closed, and told me that Meridian was Greg's arrangement, and that it wasn't something I needed to dig into. I asked her what that meant. She just repeated that it was above my pay grade, and that I should focus on processing the invoices the way I always had. I want to tell you that I let it go after that conversation. I didn't. About a week later, I noticed something else. My system access, which had always let me view full vendor payment histories for audit purposes, had been quietly scaled back. When I asked it about it, they told me it had come from a request above their level, and that they'd been told it was part of a routine permissions cleanup tied to a system migration. There was no system migration happening. I would have known. I was the one who processed half the vendor payments that would have been affected by it. That's when I started to understand that someone didn't want me looking too closely at Meridian. I didn't say anything to anyone at work after that. Instead, I started keeping my own notes on my personal laptop, dates and invoice numbers and amounts, just in case I ever needed them. I told myself I was probably overreacting. I told myself that for almost 2 more months. Then the 3rd year of profit-sharing numbers came out, and they were the lowest they'd been since I started at the company. Walt stood up again and talked about a challenging year for margins, but I'd been quietly tracking our actual client revenue through the invoicing system, and our revenue had gone up. Not down, up by almost 8%. Profit was supposedly down, revenue was up, and somewhere in the middle of that gap was a consulting company that, as far as the state of Ohio was concerned, didn't legally exist. I started looking at this less like an accounting question and more like a money problem that was directly coming out of my pocket, because every dollar that didn't show up in that profit pool was a dollar that wasn't going toward my house. A couple weeks after that, I ran into a former coworker, Priya, who used to work in our finance department before she left the company about a year earlier. We grabbed coffee, mostly to catch up, but somewhere in that conversation she mentioned, almost casually, that part of the reason she left was because she'd raised a concern about some vendor stuff with Greg and got told to drop it, almost word for word the same way Carol had told me. That was the moment I realized this wasn't something I was imagining. Someone else had seen it too, and someone else had been told to look away. I asked her if she still had any of the documentation from when she raised it. She said she didn't, because she hadn't wanted to leave the company carrying anything that could look like she'd taken confidential files with her. But she remembered enough details that, combined with what I already had, started painting a much bigger picture. I went home that night and didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about how long this might have been going on, and how much of my own profit-sharing, money I'd genuinely earned through 7 years of work, might have quietly disappeared into something that wasn't real. A few days later, I got the kind of break I wasn't expecting. I had to process a corrected W-9 form for a different vendor entirely, and while I was searching through our shared vendor drive for an old template, I found a folder that had been mislabeled, just a stray document that had landed in the wrong place during some past file reorganization. Inside it was an old LLC formation document for a business called Meridian Holdings, filed not in Ohio, but in Delaware, which is a state a lot of small businesses use because the filing requirements are lighter and the ownership details are harder to trace. The registered agent line listed a name I didn't recognize at first, Denise Sutton. It took me a second before it clicked. Greg's wife's name was Denise. I sat there staring at that document for what felt like a long time. Denise Sutton wasn't a coincidence. Greg's wife had a maiden name that, after a quick search, I confirmed matched a business listing under Meridian Holdings, member-managed, single-member LLC Denise R. Sutton. Greg had been billing his own company, through a shell business registered to his wife, for consulting work that, as far as I could tell, had never actually happened, and the money that should have gone into the profit-sharing pool that funded my house fund had been quietly draining out the back door for years. I thought that was the worst of it. It wasn't. About 2 weeks after I found that document, things at work started to shift in a way that genuinely scared me. Carol called me into her office and told me there'd been some irregularities found in a recent profit-sharing distribution calculation, and that my name had come up in connection with it. She said an adjustment form had been submitted with what looked like my signature, reallocating a chunk of bonus pool funds into a miscellaneous operating expense category. The same quarter Meridian's invoices had spiked. I told her I never signed that form. She said HR was looking into it. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I had to. The man who'd been quietly draining money out of the company for years through a fake consulting business, owned by his wife, had apparently decided that the safest way to protect himself, now that someone was getting close, was to make it look like the discrepancy was my mistake. or worse, my fraud. I asked Carol who in HR was handling it. She told me it was being run by the HR director, a man named Frank Ostrander. That name mattered more than I realized at the time. Frank Ostrander and Greg Sutton had gone to the same college. They'd been in each other's weddings. Half the office knew they golfed together every other weekend. If Greg needed someone to quietly make a problem disappear, or make sure an investigation into him stayed shallow, Frank was exactly the kind of friend who could do that without it looking obvious. That's when I understood I couldn't bring this forward through normal channels at the company. Not yet. Not without something airtight, because if I went to HR with vague suspicions, I had no doubt that Frank would protect Greg, and I'd be the one walking out the door with my name attached to a forged signature and a fabricated bonus pool error. So I stopped talking to anyone at work about it. Instead, I went quiet, and I started building a case the careful way. The first thing I did was call a former college roommate of mine who'd become an employment attorney, just to ask her, hypothetically, what someone in my position should do if they suspected vendor fraud and were worried about retaliation. She told me something I didn't fully understand until later, which was that if our profit-sharing program was structured as a qualified retirement or benefit plan, which a lot of company profit-sharing plans are, then there were federal protections under ERISA, the law that governs employee benefit plans, and that the Department of Labor takes complaints about mismanagement of those plans seriously. Especially when there's evidence of fraud being used to shrink the pool participants are entitled to. That gave me a direction. I went back through our employee handbook and benefits documentation and confirmed our profit-sharing program was in fact a qualified plan under our retirement benefits structure, not just a discretionary year-end bonus, which meant that what Greg had done wasn't just internal company fraud. It was potentially a federal violation, because he'd been using a fake vendor to siphon money out of a benefit plan that legally belonged in part to every employee who qualified for it. Over the next month, I quietly gathered everything I could carefully, and only using access and documents I already had a legitimate work reason to view. I printed nothing at the office. I photographed documents on my personal phone during my lunch break when no one else was around, and stored everything in an encrypted folder at home. I kept a detailed written timeline. I reached out to Priya again and asked if she'd be willing to give a written statement about what she remembered raising a year earlier. She said yes, on the condition that she wouldn't be the only one coming forward, because she didn't want to be the only target if this went badly. I told her she wouldn't be. I also did something I almost didn't do because it scared me. I called the Delaware registered agent listed on Meridian Holdings' formation paperwork, and without giving away too much, asked some general questions about how long the entity had been active and whether it had ever filed any annual reports showing actual business activity, the kind a legitimate consulting firm would generate. The agent couldn't give me everything, but confirmed the entity had been formed almost exactly 4 years earlier, right around the time Greg had been given expanded authority over operational vendor approvals. That timeline mattered because it meant this hadn't been a one-time lapse in judgment. It had been planned from the start. By the time I'd put everything together, here's what I had: a shell company registered to Greg's wife, 4 years of invoices for consulting work with no verifiable deliverables, a vendor address that traced back to their own home, a forged signature attempting to shift blame onto me, an HR director with a personal relationship to the man under suspicion, and a former employee who'd raised the same concerns a year earlier and been quietly pushed out. What I didn't have yet was proof that the consulting work had genuinely never happened, because Greg could always claim Meridian had done real work, just informally, without much paperwork. I needed something harder to argue around. That came from a place I didn't expect. Through a connection of my attorney friend, I was introduced to a forensic accountant who'd handled similar small business fraud cases before, and she suggested something simple. If Meridian had genuinely provided logistics optimization and route consulting, there would be emails, meeting notes, deliverables, something, anywhere in the company's systems, even old ones. I still had limited but legitimate access to certain shared drives as part of my role, and over the following weeks I quietly searched, using nothing but innocuous, work-related search terms, for any record of Meridian ever submitting actual consulting output. I found exactly nothing. 4 years, over $400,000, and not a single deliverable, report, or meeting record anywhere in the company's systems. At that point, I knew I had enough. I filed a formal whistleblower complaint with the Department of Labor's Employee Benefits Security Administration, the federal office that investigates exactly this kind of profit-sharing and benefits plan fraud, and I included everything I had documented. I also retained my attorney friend formally, not just as a favor, to make sure I was protected from retaliation while the process moved forward, because federal whistleblower protections only help you if you've actually built a paper trail showing you used the proper channels. I want to be honest with you. The weeks after I filed that complaint were some of the hardest of my life. I kept showing up to work like nothing had changed, sitting 2 cubicles down from a man I now knew had been quietly stealing from me and everyone else in that building for years, smiling at him in the break room, saying good morning, because I knew that if he sensed anything was coming, he'd have time to cover his tracks even further. Then the internal forgery accusation against me escalated. Frank called me into a formal meeting with Carol present and told me the company was placing me on a temporary leave of absence while they completed their review of the bonus pool discrepancy tied to my name. I sat there and listened to a man who had no idea what I'd already set in motion tell me calmly that this was just standard procedure and that I shouldn't read too much into it. I almost laughed. I didn't because I needed to stay composed, but it took everything in me not to tell him exactly what I knew. That's when things got worse before they got better, because being placed on leave meant I had even less visibility into what was happening day to day. And for almost 3 weeks I genuinely didn't know whether the company was building a case to fire me before the DOL complaint I'd filed ever got traction. What I didn't know at the time was that EBSA complaints involving potential fraud in a qualified benefit plan often get referred quickly to a deeper investigative track, especially when there's a documented paper trail like the one I'd handed them. While I was sitting at home on unpaid leave, an investigator had already reached out to the company requesting records, and not the kind of casual records request that gets quietly buried. A formal one with a federal letterhead, requesting 4 years of vendor documentation related to Meridian Freight Consulting and Meridian Holdings. I found out later that when that letter landed on Walt's desk, he had absolutely no idea what it was about. Walt, to his credit, wasn't part of any of this. He genuinely believed Greg's explanations about shrinking margins every single year. When the company's outside counsel got involved and explained what the federal request actually meant, Walt ordered an immediate internal audit, and for the first time, an external forensic accounting firm, completely separate from anyone inside the company, was brought in to go through every vendor account with elevated authority access, including mine and including Greg's. I want to tell you the moment it all fell apart was dramatic. It wasn't not at first. It was quiet, the way these things often are. An external auditor matched Meridian's banking details against Denise Sutton's personal accounts within about 2 days of getting access to the records, because shell companies are good at hiding from casual searches, but they're not built to survive a professional forensic review with subpoena power behind it. Once that connection was confirmed, everything moved fast. I got a call from my attorney telling me the company's outside counsel wanted to speak with me, not as someone under suspicion anymore, but as a witness. Within the same week, I learned that Greg had been placed on administrative leave, the same kind of leave I'd been placed on weeks earlier, except his didn't end with him quietly being reinstated. The forensic accountants found a clean, traceable pattern once they knew what they were looking for. Every single Meridian invoice corresponded almost exactly to a transfer into a personal investment account, jointly held by Greg and Denise. Over 4 years, the total came to just over $420,000, every cent of it pulled, directly or indirectly, from money that should have gone into the company's profit pool, the same pool my house fund had been quietly bleeding out of for 3 years running. The forged adjustment form with my supposed signature was traced back to a printer in Greg's own office, using a digital signature template lifted from an old expense report I'd actually signed years earlier. It hadn't been a sophisticated forgery. It had been a desperate one, made by a man who realized someone was finally getting close and panicked. Frank, the HR director, wasn't found to have actively participated in the fraud itself, but the investigation did uncover that he'd received and sat on Priya's complaint a year earlier without ever escalating it, which violated the company's own compliance policy. He resigned before the company could formally terminate him, which tells you everything you need to know about how confident he was in surviving that conversation. Greg was terminated immediately once the forensic findings were confirmed. The company's outside counsel referred the case to the local district attorney's economic crimes unit, and a few months later, Greg was formally charged with multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement, along with charges related to falsifying company records. Denise was named as a co-defendant given her direct ownership of the shell entity that received the funds. I won't pretend the legal process was fast, because it wasn't. It took almost a year from the day charges were filed to the day Greg accepted a plea agreement rather than go to trial, which included restitution to the company and a multi-year prison sentence. Denise's case resolved separately, with a smaller restitution order and probation, since the investigation found she hadn't been as deeply involved in the day-to-day mechanics, just the convenient owner of an account that received money she knew she wasn't entitled to. For me, the company reinstated my position immediately once the audit cleared my name completely, with full back pay for the time I'd been on leave. But the part that actually mattered to me was what happened with the profit-sharing pool. Because the embezzlement had been confirmed as directly reducing the qualified plan's distributions over 4 years, the company, under pressure from both legal counsel and the ongoing DOL involvement, agreed to recalculate and reissue corrected profit-sharing distributions for every eligible employee going back to when Meridian's payments started. My corrected distribution, the difference between what I should have received over those years and what I'd actually been paid, came out to just under $11,000. It wasn't life-changing money on its own, but combined with what I'd already saved, it was exactly enough to push my house fund over the number I'd been chasing for 3 years. I bought my house about 5 months after that. A small 3-bedroom about 20 minutes outside the city, nothing fancy, but it was mine, paid for with money I'd actually earned, finally landing in the account it was always supposed to land in. The company also offered me a new role, leading internal vendor compliance reviews, which felt like a strange kind of full circle. The same access that had once been quietly restricted because I was asking too many questions was now formally part of my job description, except this time, nobody could take it away from me without a very good reason. Priya ended up giving a formal statement as part of the investigation too, and the company reached out to her directly to apologize for how her original complaint had been handled, though I think we both know an apology a year late doesn't undo much. Still, she told me it helped to know she'd been right all along, and that speaking up eventually mattered, even if it took someone else picking up where she'd been forced to leave off. As for Greg, the last I heard, he was a few years into his sentence, and Denise was working to pay off a restitution order that, given everything, will probably follow them for a long time. Looking back, the thing that stays with me isn't even the money, even though the money mattered. It's how close this came to ending the other way. If I hadn't found that mislabeled folder, if Priya hadn't mentioned her own complaint over coffee, if the profit-sharing plan hadn't technically qualified for federal protection. Any one of those missing pieces, and Greg might have successfully pinned this whole thing on me instead, and I'd have spent years rebuilding a reputation I never should have had to defend in the first place. So that's my story. If you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Hidden Karma Stories for more unbelievable stories where karma eventually catches up with people. And let me know in the comments what you would have done in my position. Thanks for listening.